All right, so the next class in the phylum Chordata is the class Osteichthyes, which is the class that contains the fish with an endoskeleton made out of bone. These will have scales. I didn't mention with the chondrichthyes, the cartilaginous fish, the sharks, that they don't have scales like fish have. They have what we call denticles. It's almost like little tiny teeth. So if you rub your hand across the skin of a shark, it feels kind of like sandpaper. But the bony fish have scales, and the scales have lots of colors, so you're going to see a lot of variation in color in these fish. They all have gills, which is how they breathe, and so water comes across the gills, and they're able to take oxygen out of the water, and then that oxygen is absorbed into the blood and carried through the rest of the body. And so in terms of the group of fish, the bony fish make up the biggest part of that group, 95% or somewhere in that range, and they have huge diversity. So if we look at the two fish pictures that I have here on the right, the soldier fish is one that lives up closer to the surface, maybe in coral reefs and things like that, and you can see that he has quite a bit of color. The one at the bottom is an anglerfish, and it's a very deep sea fish, so it doesn't have a lot of color. There's no light down there, and you notice he's got where eyes would have been, but he doesn't really have eyes. And then he has this little angler on the front that has phosphorescent bacteria in it. And so basically they produce a little bit of light, which will sometimes attract fish to that area right there. And then that's how that fish is able to get food, is that it uses bacteria to help attract other organisms to that fish. So just for a little bit of a look at the variation or the diversity. So the two fish on, let's see, this one here is a freshwater fish. It does have a little bit of color, not a lot. These ones here are barracudas. They don't have a lot of color, but they're silver. And they're marine, they live in the ocean. And then the two on the right are also marine. So I don't know if you realize that a seahorse is actually a fish. It's a bony fish. And then this fish at the bottom is the state fish of Hawaii. It's the Humuhumu Nuku Nuku Apua. So lots of diversity in terms of size and shape and color and all of those kinds of things. Okay, and I put a couple more just to show you a little bit more diversity. So this one here is a dragonfish, and it's in the same group as the seahorses. You notice it just has fins that are a lot more complicated, helps it to camouflage within seaweed. This one here is the lionfish, and those spines there have toxins in them, and they have become a little bit of an invasive species in the Atlantic because people will buy them for their home aquariums, and then maybe they decide they don't want them anymore and they just put them into the ocean, and they're not native to the Atlantic Ocean, they're native to Asia, and so they don't have predators, which means they're killing off a lot of fish that normally wouldn't have that as a predator. And so there's actually some groups out there that are having citizen science. So you don't have to be a scientist, but they show you how to catch the lionfish so that you can keep them alive, and then they transport them to where would be a native area for them to live. This one here on the left is a sunfish. So it's a very large fish. That looks like it's almost all head. So I did put a couple of videos here for you to watch just so you can see some of the variety, and one of those has sunfish in it. And then this one here, this is a freshwater catfish, and it was pulled out of the Mekong River in Vietnam. Probably very, very old. You can see how big it is compared to those people. So lots of diversity. the things to remember are that they have scales, they have gills, they have a bony endoskeleton, and they're make up the highest percentage of any fish group. So when we move from the fish, which are that live in water, to land, we're looking at terrestrial vertebrates. And so in this case, if they're living on land, then they're not going to have gills for respiration. They're going to have lungs, okay? So respiratory system is adapting a little bit. They have a more advanced circulatory system. So remember we said the fish have a two-chambered heart. When we get to amphibians, which is our next group, they have a three-chambered heart, so it's a little bit more efficient. And then when we get to the mammals, which is what we are, we have a four-chambered heart. So the class Amphibia is the first group of vertebrates that actually is able to survive on land. So they don't have fins, they have limbs, they have eyelids to cover their eyes, or the eyelid closes so that they can moisturize the surface of the eye. They have ears, and I'm going to point out right here, this is the surface of the skin, and it's located back around here on the frog, but you see that it has an eardrum, but it doesn't have the outer ear like we have, so it's just right there on the surface of the skin. They have a larynx, which we didn't see in the fish. So the larynx is your voice box. You know, if you've gone out in East Texas or out in the country in the summertime, you hear all the frogs, which they're making those calls for mating calls, but they have a very well-developed voice box. They have small lungs, so they're adapting to living on land. They're not fully adapted, and so their lungs are a little bit small, and we'll talk a little bit about their respiration here in a second. So we refer to them as amphibia, which means double life, and the reason for that is because they spend part of their life on land, but they do have a part of their life cycle that they spend in the water. Okay, so they have external fertilization. So the female frog is going to lay a bunch of eggs either right next to the water or in the water, and they're kind of in a big jelly-like sac. And then the male frog will come and leave sperm, and that way the eggs will get fertilized, but they're going to be fertilized outside the body of the female. So that means there has to be water for the sperm to swim to the egg. And then they go through a metamorphosis process. So when those eggs hatch, the first thing that comes out is a little tadpole. And you notice as it goes through the metamorphosis that the same markings that you find on the tadpole you will see on the frog, but the gills will go away. It will lose its tail, and then it will spend the rest of its life on land. So this is a pretty good video to illustrate that, so you might want to take a look at that video. So I said we'd mention the reason for the small lungs. So they're not completely adapted to land, so their lungs are small and they're not super efficient. And so the other organ that the amphibians use for respiration or breathing is their skin. So their skin is thin and moist, which means that oxygen can actually move across the skin into the blood, and so they're getting oxygen from both breathing and using their lungs, but also across their skin. Okay, so examples of organisms in this group: frogs. So this is a rainforest tree frog. Toads, which still have the thinner, moist skin, but they're maybe a little bit rougher and a little bit wartier. And then salamanders, which we'll take a look at a picture of here. This is a kind of nice video on the reproduction of the dart frog. Okay, so we mentioned frogs. Here's the frog, here's a toad, and then here's a salamander. And all of those are good examples of amphibians. And I did like this photo. It came from The Scientist, which is a journal, but it's a picture from the underside of the South American glass frog, and you can see that its skin is very thin and moist, but it's also transparent. So you can see the inside internal organs without ever even opening up that frog. So you can see digestive organs, and it looks like it's a female because it looks like they're eggs that are almost ready to be laid. So the next step up, we went from the fish, which live in the water, to the amphibians, which have a little bit of a double life, to the reptiles, which we say are truly terrestrial, meaning they live their entire life on land, or they can live their entire life on land. Okay, so they have scales, but they're pretty hard. They're keratinized. Remember, keratin is a protein that's waterproof. So that's what they have on the outside. And I think some people or some students kind of don't like snakes, think they're slimy and gross, but really they're not slimy. They're very smooth and dry because of these hard scales. Because they spend their whole life on land, they have very well developed lungs, so they're not using their skin as part of their respiratory system. They're also ectothermic, which means that they are dependent on the environment to maintain their temperature. So you can see that alligator that's sitting up on top of a log. If he gets a little cold, he's going to sit out in the sun. If he gets a little bit warm, he's going to get in the water and maybe go down to the bottom. So there are some reptiles that do live in water, but they're completely terrestrial and could live on land. If you think about snakes or lizards or things like that, you know, they might not go in the water, but they might go under a rock or down under, you know, in a hole in the ground if it gets too hot to help them cool off. So I didn't put a lot on this slide about the amniotic egg, but I do want to talk about that just a little bit. So as far as their reproduction goes, they have internal fertilization, which means the egg is fertilized inside the body of the female, okay? And once that happens, then they will lay a fertilized egg, which the little embryo then is going to grow inside that egg and then hatch out when it's fully developed. So the egg shell part is actually leathery. It's not hard and calcified like maybe a chicken egg is. Okay, so it's more of a leathery egg. I think maybe you can kind of see that here. And we call it an amniotic egg, meaning that you can see on this picture it shows the amnion, which is a membrane. It shows the allantois and the chorion. These are all membranes that you would find in human reproduction that are part of the human embryo. But in humans, the embryo is growing within the body of the female. And so you find these same membranes inside the shell and surrounding the embryo of the reptiles. Okay, so they have similar development that we have. You notice they also have a yolk sac. So in a chicken egg, that yolk sac is very big, and that's what we are consuming and getting our fat from if we eat chicken eggs. Okay, so when those little reptiles, whatever they are, the snake or the alligator, they have a little egg tooth which they kind of poke a hole in the egg and then they slowly work themselves out of the egg. So examples, and we said they're truly terrestrial, which means they can live on land their whole life, but we do find some that do live in the water. So there are some turtles that live in the water. There's also some water snakes, but you should know examples. So turtles, alligators, snakes, lizards, all good examples of reptiles.